In this video, we're going to explore the Judeo-Christian God and the creative energy associated with him. So I'm gearing this video towards a general audience, so certainly if you're a believer, you'll probably find it interesting. But even if you're a skeptic, this video is still going to give you insights into a believer's perspective on the concept of God. So in the biblical narrative, one of the very first things we learn about God is that he has a voice. God says thus, and it was so. And we're going to get more into that in a bit, but another thing we learn is that man is made in the image of God. So ponder that for a moment. When we look at our own planet and the animal kingdom, when we look out into the vastness of space and observe all the stars and galaxies and all the majestic splendor contained therein, of all that there is, only man is said to be created in the image of God. Now, if that's true, on one hand, that should give you some self-respect. You're a creature made in the image of God. But it also should bring some perspective and humility because so is everybody else. In the Great Commandment, half of it deals with how you treat other people. Now, I'm going to speculate that you can learn a lot about an artist by studying their art. So let's assume the biblical narrative and let's assume that man is created in the image of God. One of the unique things about humans is their capacity for speech. Now, it's true that other animals have voices too. You know, a dog can bark, whales do their thing, an owl can hoot. But none of that approaches man's capacity for complex speech. And not only does man have the capacity for this speech, but he also has the capacity to understand it and interpret it. So we can form complex languages and communicate with masses of people. You know, we can articulate thoughts and ideas that we have and learn from each other. You know, this also allows for social cooperation on a grand scale. Man is unique in this. No other animal can engage in this the same way that men can. And we have yet to find intelligent life in the rest of the universe as we observe it. So as far as we know, we're it. We're the only ones that can do what we do. Now I'm going to get more into speech and truly how powerful our capacity for speech is. But let's set that aside for a moment and consider what precedes speech. Before we articulate a thought, we first have to have a thought. Where does that come from exactly? On one hand, we do have a capacity to sort of direct our thoughts. If we're trying to solve a particular problem, we can focus on it and try to devise solutions. But most thoughts that we have just randomly appear there for us to observe. Anyone who's into mindfulness and has ever practiced the meditation would be keenly aware of this. You know, during meditation, a person tries to pull their focus into the moment, usually by focusing on something such as their breathing. And the point of the exercise is just to stay focused in the moment on your breathing for as long as you can. And inevitably, your train of focus gets derailed and some random thing pops into your head and you start thinking about that instead. So as a person's meditating, they're constantly losing their focus, recentering themselves once they realize they've lost their focus. And this process unfolds over and over and over again. And with practice, the whole idea behind it is that the more you practice this, the more you'll be able to draw your focus into the moment when you need it to be focused in the moment. But obviously, those thoughts that just popped into your head, you didn't put there, not consciously. Your purpose was to focus on your breathing. So where do all those thoughts come from? Are they just the random result of biochemistry and the electrical impulses that are firing around between your brain cells? Are some of those thoughts put there by a higher power? I mean, in any event, it's a pretty miraculous thing that these thoughts just bubble up in our consciousness, and we get to observe them. But that begs another question. Who exactly is observing our thoughts? I mean, generally speaking, our sense of ourselves is wrapped up and tethered to that which is observing our thoughts, what you might think of as the miracle of consciousness. And for most of us, we're so anchored to that notion that we seldom even question it. You know, why do I wake up every morning in this particular body, tethered to this particular observation station where I'm observing the thoughts that I perceive to be in my head? You know, why am I tethered to this vantage point? Why don't I wake up one morning and observe the thoughts of somebody else? Why can't I assume the consciousness of, say, a bird one day? That would be kind of cool. Spend the afternoon flying around and hunting down rodents. But no, we're tethered to a particular point of observation. However, it's often advantageous for us to consider other points of observation. Think of the concept of wisdom for a moment. When we say somebody's wise, maybe that man was a wise ruler or a wise judge, what do we really mean by that? How does one become thought of as wise? Well, generally it's a person that has the capacity and the openness to consider a multitude of perspectives. And he does this by getting into other people's heads. Not that they necessarily can read other people's minds. You don't always need ESP to know what other people are thinking. Often you can figure out what other people are thinking just by listening to them and letting them tell you and observing their actions. Another way to do it is to imagine yourself in a similar situation. What would I do if I was in that person's shoes? So a wise person can not only perceive a problem from multiple perspectives, which in and of itself requires a certain level of humility. To even be interested in other perspectives, you first have to concede that you have a limited perspective. There's probably tons of information out there that you don't know, and to get a better understanding of something, you need more perspectives. So not only do they have to perceive other perspectives, but then they need to be able to arbitrate between them in a reasonable manner to come up with an equitable solution, which is quite a process. You need to listen to all these different perspectives, then you have to sort of judge them on their own merits. Is this a reasonable take? Is this unreasonable? And once you sort through all that, you have to weigh it out and figure out what the most equitable solution is. And if you can do that consistently, men will begin to think of you as wise. Now, as men, made in the image of God, we have the capacity to do that. That said, our capacity is still very much limited, because again, we're tethered to our own point of observation. The best we can do is imagine ourselves in other people's shoes. The best we can do is actually take the time to listen to other people's perspectives and to observe their actions. But that's still guesswork at the end of the day. Howbeit, it's ordered and disciplined guesswork if you're doing it correctly. But you can never really know exactly what somebody's going through. You can only empathize with them. And maybe more so if you've had a similar experience. But it's never exactly the same. You can never exactly know what somebody else is going through. Now, the God of the Bible does not have this problem. Now, imagine how wise you could be if nothing was withheld from you. If everything was an open book. If you heard everybody's thoughts as clearly or more so than they did. And you could directly perceive the consciousness of any living creature. That's sort of the definition of omniscience. And that's certainly an attribute attributed to God throughout the Old and New Testament. One of the earliest examples of this would be in the story of the flood. Prior to sending the flood, we're told that the earth was full of violence, and the imagination of men's hearts was only evil continually. Here God had created man in his own image, and given him this marvelous capacity to think and speak and create. He gave him a garden to keep, basically gave him a blank canvas to go out and build a society. And rather than build a just one, the consensus among men seemed to be to build a violent hell on earth. And evidently God thought, well, that's about enough of this. Let's reboot and start over. Hence the story of Noah and the flood. And throughout the Old Testament, throughout the prophets, there's indications that God perceives our thoughts. In the Old Testament, he's often referred to as the Most High. Now, height is often associated with authority. When a man becomes a king, we say he ascended to the throne. But height is also indicative of a superior vantage point. If you climb up a tall hill or onto a mountain, and you get above the tree line, you can see for miles. If we think of ourselves, we have a limited vantage point from which to perceive the world around us. As where God is sort of the prime observer, the observer of observers. The gift of consciousness that we enjoy is a marvel unto itself, but the consciousness of God is beyond our comprehension. But let's return our focus to speech. We had our thought with our consciousness, and now we want to articulate that to somebody else. Just like the miraculousness of consciousness that we're prone to take advantage of because we're basically a fish in water. We've been conscious our whole lives. Many of us never stop to think, wow, isn't this amazing? Here I am, a sentient being, living and conscious and in a world full of other sentient beings. Instead of having a sense of awe and maybe a sense of gratitude about that, we tend to get wrapped up in ourselves and take the whole thing for granted. Likewise, the ability of us to speak and communicate. First of all, in order for speech to even take place, there's basically an orchestra level of complexity at work between my larynx and my mouth, moving and vibrating at just the right frequencies to make complex speech even possible. And I do it effortlessly. I don't even have to think about at what aperture does my larynx have to open up and how do I move my tongue and mouth and what have you to make the words that I want to say. I don't even think about it. I just decide what I want to say and say it, and the subconscious portion of my nervous system takes care of the rest. Now there's a learning process involved. Obviously, it takes a child a few years to develop this ability, and it takes many more years to learn to speak well, and more years still to actually have some experiences where you have an interesting perspective to give the world. But nonetheless, it's still this miraculous thing that we can just effortlessly talk and communicate with one another. And really, what is speech? It is a transfer of energy. So it starts with our nervous system, starts with our consciousness bubbling up thoughts and ideas that we want to communicate, then an intricate network of nerves tell all the muscles involved to form contractions and steer all the organs that are associated with speech into doing their thing. So it's sort of a biomechanical energy. It starts with cognition, turns into biomechanical energy. That energy then vibrates the air molecules in our mouth, and the atmosphere around us begins to resonate with the sound waves that we're producing. It sends out a frequency, and anybody within earshot of us who has ears that work, provided they speak the same language, can understand what we're saying. And that's another miracle. The words we speak vibrate the atmosphere around us. This frequency reaches the ears of other observers, begins to vibrate the organs in their inner ear. Those messages are relayed to their part of the brains that recognize speech patterns, and they can understand what we're saying. So not only does our speech have an effect on the air around us, it has an effect on the people around us. And it can be for better or for worse. The ability to speak is a very powerful thing. And it's a power that can be used for good, and it's a power that can be used for evil. Or it could be used for just amoral entertainment. And not to go off on too much of a tangent, but it's one of the reasons I'm almost a free speech absolutist. I think in a free society, people should pretty much be able to say whatever they want. The only exception I would make would be explicit calls to violence. I think there's a legitimate case to be made that the government can regulate that type of speech. You know, if you stand outside a house of worship or, say, the private residence of somebody that you don't like, and you start telling other people to harm those people or burn that building down, well, that's a call to violence, and I think that should be speech that a legitimate government can regulate. But anything else is fair game. Is it dangerous? Sure. But life is about trade-offs, and I would rather deal with the problems of too much liberty as opposed to not enough. Censorship is often just a tool of a tyrannical ruling class to maintain their power. In a free society, we need to be able to speak truth to power. We need to be able to question those in positions of authority, lest they become despotic and corrupt. That said, I still recognize it as a potentially dangerous weapon. In fact, I self-regulate my speech all the time. From the Christian perspective, every idle word men shall speak, they will give account thereof in the day of their judgment. So one ought to be careful in how they use their speech. You can use your speech to help foster harmony and help build a fair and just society.
I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Or you can use it to usher in a dystopian hell on earth.
Für richtig hält's, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit...
There's many examples of great orators doing just that. Just look to the last century and all the horror shows contained therein. But if man can speak, and we're created in the image of God, and we're sort of a shadow of our Creator with a spark of divinity, imagine what God's voice can do. If our voice resonates with the atmosphere around us, perhaps the entire universe resonates to the sound of God's voice. So in the opening verses of Genesis, and I'm paraphrasing, it says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was formless and empty." In verse 3, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So he calls forth these things and he begins to name them and define them, and begins to create this habitat for his creatures that he'll later create, ultimately leading to the creation of man in his own image. Moving forward to the New Testament, say the first book of John, we see the creation summarized as, "In the beginning was the Word," capital W, "and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind." And through the ministry of Christ in the New Testament, we see the power of that word. In the New Testament narrative, there's an interaction between Christ and a centurion. Now, in the Roman world, a centurion was a Roman officer. And in every military, there's a hierarchy. Higher-ranking officers give orders to their subordinates, generally lower-ranking officers. Those lower-ranking officers then give orders down the chain of command, ultimately down to the foot soldiers, the rank-and-file enlisted men. So the centurion, this Roman officer, comes to Christ asking for help and says to him, "Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed and is suffering terribly." And Christ asks him, "Shall I come and heal him?" And the centurion replies to him, "Lord, I do not deserve that you come under my roof. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I say to this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." So then Christ goes on to say the word, heals his servant, and then commends the centurion for his faith. The centurion perceived that just as he was a man of authority in the worldly realm, he was a military officer and he could tell people to do what he wanted them to do, he perceived that Christ was in a position of authority in a spiritual realm. All Christ needed to do was speak the word, and it would be so, because ultimately the universe resonates to his will and his word. There's another story in the New Testament where Jesus is aboard a ship with his disciples. And as these ships are crossing over the sea from one side to the other, Jesus and his disciples are aboard one of them. Christ is asleep, and as he's sleeping, a great storm comes and the waves pick up. And the disciples begin to fear for their lives, thinking the storm is going to capsize and sink their vessel. So out of desperation, they wake up Christ and ask him, don't you care if we drowned? And Christ just calmly gets up and tells the storm to quiet and be still. And then the wind dies down and the sea becomes completely calm. At which point his disciples are even more terrified and they say, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." So I'm going to end this video with one other example of the voice of God in the biblical narrative. In the Old Testament, there's a prophet by the name of Elijah. And there's prophets throughout the Old Testament. Being a prophet could be a rather precarious job. Sometimes the prophets were received by the people that they were sent unto and accepted, such as the case with Jonah and the people of Nineveh. The people of Nineveh in that time actually accepted Jonah and received his message and repented, which spared them from God's wrath. But there's many other examples of God's prophets and servants being brutalized by the people they were sent to. This is a common theme throughout the Old and New Testament. Starting with Abel, who of course was slain by his own brother out of envy. You could look to the story of Joseph, who was beaten by his own brothers, thrown down a well, and then later sold into slavery. You could look to Daniel,
whom the Babylonians tried to feed to lions and then later tried to burn him alive in a furnace. So certainly being one of God's servants and being called to speak truth to power can potentially be detrimental to your health. It can get you nailed to a cross, figuratively or otherwise. Now Elijah was a prophet sent to the people of Israel at a time when children of Israel were in all-out rebellion against God. They'd all turned away and began to worship other gods, all the way up to the ruling class, the king and queen of Israel. So Elijah dutifully does his job, puts the false prophets of Baal to shame, creating a commotion, and then he flees into the wilderness, fearing for his life. After all, it's not without precedent for the world to abuse God's servants and his prophets. So Elijah's held up in this cave in this mountain, believing the world is against him. And this great wind comes and beats up against the mountain and shatters rocks, yet Elijah's not moved because the Lord is not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake comes, and still the Lord is not in the earthquake. Then a fire comes and rages. The Lord is not in the fire. And lastly, a still small voice is heard. And at this, Elijah does fear, because he knows the Lord is in this still small voice. So at this, he arises and does all his Lord's bidding. Now in the Christian tradition, the ministry of Elijah in the Old Testament is often seen as foreshadowing the work of John the Baptist in the New Testament, as he's out in the wilderness calling men to repentance. And for his trouble, he's imprisoned and then later executed. Such is the life of a prophet. Now certainly to a believer, there's instruction to be gleaned from these stories and the biblical narrative. But even if you're a total skeptic who views the Bible as merely allegory, there's still value in these stories. One point both a believer and a skeptic can probably agree on is that you're only guaranteed one life. And a lot of this life is determined for us. We don't get to pick where we're born or who we're born to. A lot of our innate characteristics are just the hand we're dealt. But we do have some autonomy as to how we play that hand, how we choose to live our life. We can choose if we want to live courageously and spend our time seeking the truth. If and when we find the truth, we can choose to boldly proclaim the truth, even if doing so costs us personally. Or we can choose a more timid existence, searching for safety and security, not trying to rock the boat too much. And we can just quietly hope the dangers of our times pass. Maybe someone else will step up and say what needs to be said. And those people can take the heat for us. Personally, I like to think that I aspire to the former, because frankly, the latter seems a little bit boring.
Good evening. Have you ever given any thought to the kingdom of heaven?
What?
Repent. The kingdom of heaven is at hand.
You ain't just whistling Dixie.
Armageddon is almost upon us.
I got news for you. It's already here.
Go away!
But your souls are in danger.
Our lives are in danger, you beatnik.
You've been watching the Fletch Report. If you're hearing this, it means you've made it to the end of the video. But before you click onto the next thing and continue down whatever rabbit hole you're on YouTube or Rumble, I've got a small favor to ask. If you found value in my content and you want to help the channel out, the best thing you can do is share it with somebody else that you think will find value in it. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see more. Links to the channel on YouTube and Rumble will be provided below. Additionally, I'm making a Facebook page for the channel as well as a X/formerly Twitter. Feel free to follow me on those platforms as well. If you're feeling exceptionally generous, provided in the description below will be a link to Buy Me a Coffee, which is the online equivalent of a tip jar. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting the channel.